Alright, so now that we've got the initial setup for this particular application, I want to go ahead and start adding some content to it. So in order to do this, I need to first introduce another class to this, which is going to be the scene. So we'll do another import. This is going to come from the scene package, so that'll be scene with a lowercase s. And then we want to get the scene class, that'll be scene with a capital S. Go ahead and save that. And then once I've got this scene, I want to go ahead and actually start to construct it. So to do that, it'll basically be the same as when I construct any other object that we've seen previously. So we'll specify that class type of scene. We'll give the variable for this some kind of name. So I'm just going to call this scene with a lowercase s. We'll use that new keyword to set aside some memory for this object. And then we'll make a call to the constructor for the scene. So this is just a preliminary setup for the actual construction of our scene object. One thing to keep in mind is that while I've set this up to just show this sort of no-args constructor for the scene, there's not actually a no-args constructor available for the scene class. So if I were to try to run this as it is right now, this would give me an error of some kind. So I need to add some additional content that I want to put into the scene and then display to the application window. So in order to add this additional content, I want to go ahead and make another import. So I'm going to go get a control of some kind. So the very first control that I want to introduce is going to be a label. And a label is essentially just going to be some text that I want to display in my application window. So we'll do an import, do JavaFX.scene, and then from the scene package, I can then navigate to the control package. And from the control package, I can get the label class. Okay. And then once I've got that class, I can go ahead and create an object for it. So we'll make a label. I'll call the variable for it label. We'll do a new label. And then within the constructor for the label, I want to go ahead and provide some text that I want to display to my application window. So the text for this, I'll just make this the same as the title itself. So I'll just say something like my first GUI application. And then once I've got this set up, I want to then go ahead and take that label that I made and actually put that into my scene. And then once I've got my scene set up, I want to actually make sure that this is set for my stage. So I'm going to do my primary stage dot set scene and then pass in that scene object. Okay. And so now that I've got this set up, I can go ahead and compile this. So I'll do JavaFX, my first GUI.java. So we're able to compile that, and then I want to go ahead and actually display it. So we'll just go ahead and run it. Okay. So now that we have it running, we can see that there's a bit of an issue with it, which is that unlike what we had before when we didn't put any content into it, now the size of the application window has been reduced significantly. It's actually only large enough to display the contents of that label. So we can see that the length and the height have been kind of shrunk down so that only the window itself, or only the label itself, is visible. This doesn't even affect the title, so or it's not, the title is not considered when trying to resize the window, so that's being kind of cut off. So I'm going to go ahead and increase the size of this so we can actually see that label in there. So what you're seeing right now, that effect that it had on the size of the application window, the setup that it's using is what's known as the default application size. We have a default height and a default length or width, which is only large enough to display all of the content that we've put inside of the window. So a little bit later, we'll take a look at how to actually customize the window to account for this, to make it a little bit larger in our own preferences. But as we can see right now, just by the default sizing, it's only large enough to be able to display that single label. And so then if I add more content to this, it will continue to adjust by default whenever I open the window for the first time to just fit that content that I put into it. So I'll go ahead and close this and then come back over to my code for this application. And now what I want to go ahead and do is actually introduce a container, or put another way, a layout for this. So the very first type of container that I want to consider is going to be what's known as an HBox, which is essentially used to set up various controls in a sort of horizontal fashion. So we'll do another import. This will again come to the scene package, and then from there we want to go to the layout package, and then within the layout package we want to get the HBox class. Okay. So then going from here, we want to go ahead and actually make an HBox. So use a pretty similar naming convention that I've done for all of the other classes so far. So I'll just call this HBox with a lowercase h and a lowercase b. This is equal to a new HBox. And then the thing that I want to pass into this HBox is going to be the different controls or possibly additional containers that I want to actually set up in this horizontal fashion. So for this one right now, all I have is that label. And then for my scene, I want to go ahead and modify this. So instead of using the label itself, I now want to use that HBox that's going to contain all of my content in that horizontal fashion. So obviously, with a setup like this, I want to go ahead and add some additional content, so maybe a few more labels. So I've got our first label. We can go ahead and add a second label, call this something like label 2. This would be a new label. Then we can say something like this is inside of an HBox. And then maybe add one final label, call it label 3, and say this is a new label. And we'll call this something, or make the content for this something like this is in a horizontal arrangement. Okay. And so then what I want to go ahead and do is make sure that each one of these labels are actually inside of that HBox. So I'm going to go ahead and do label, and then label 2, and then label 3. And so then when I pass this HBox into my scene, as we can see right here on line 23, this is going to contain all 3 of those labels that I put inside of that HBox. And then on line 25, we'll go ahead and actually put that into the content for our stage, and at line 27, actually display all of that in our application window to the monitor. Okay, so now that we've got all that, we'll go ahead and recompile this, and then run it. And so now you can actually see that the length of this has grown a bit so that it can fit all 3 of these labels that we put in. But you'll also notice that even if I resize this a little bit, it's not really going to adjust the position of each of these labels relative to each other. Instead, all 3 of them are going to be kind of bunched together now. So you'll see the very first one, which has my first GUI application. We'll see a little bit right here where the next one starts. We have this is inside of an HBox, and then right here where the next one starts, this is in a horizontal arrangement. So in addition to the fact that the height and the length of our application window by default are only large enough to be able to fit the content inside of that window, we can also see that there's a bit of an issue with the amount of spacing between the elements, say maybe the elements inside of an HBox. There's also another minor issue that I want to try to account for, which is the amount of spacing between these elements and the edges of our application window. So we'll see that there are a few different problems that I want to try to address by being able to sort of recustomize this window. Say things like the spacing between the elements, the amount of padding that they have from the edges of the application window, and then also that default height and width of the application window. So there are various things that I want to try to correct or fix at some point a little bit later. Okay. One last thing I want to go ahead and wrap up with on here is that I want to go ahead and take a look at 2 other additional controls besides the label, just to make sure that we've covered all of the basic controls that I want to consider through this first series of video discussions about JavaFX. So in addition to the label, 2 additional controls that I want to include are going to be the text field and the button. So we'll go ahead and bring in both of those. So they have a very similar import. So they both come from that control package. The first one's going to be text field, and then the last one's going to be my button. Okay. And for this particular part, what I want to go ahead and do is, instead of using 3 labels, I'm going to use a label, a text field, and a button. And what I want to do is, even though this isn't going to have any sort of functionality to it yet, we'll talk a little bit about actually trying to create functionality for our GUIs much later in the series of discussions. I at least want to take a look at the layout if I was going to use a label, a text field, and a button, just to make sure that we've at least seen what that's like. So for this particular example, what I'm going to do is essentially create something that looks kind of like the setup for just a single field in maybe some kind of form that we would see. So I'm going to go ahead and create my label. I'm going to change this to call it name. We'll call this name label. So this is going to be essentially a label that's associated with some kind of name field. And then for this next one, I want to go ahead and remove this and replace it with a text field. We'll call this something like name text field, and say this is equal to a new text field. We won't need to specify any additional content for this. We'll just go ahead and create a default text field with nothing inside of it yet. And then finally, I want to go ahead and make a button. Call this name button. Make a new button. And for the button, I do actually want to go ahead and specify some text for this. Basically, we'll say that this could be sort of like a submit button of some kind. One additional thing I want to make a mention of, just to make sure that we understand precisely what this text field is going to be. This is essentially just going to be some kind of input mechanism where you could type some text. We have a text field. Much later, we'll take a look at another similar construction, which is going to be a text area. For this case, with a text field, it's just a single line of input that it's expecting. So we're going to be using that essentially to be able to enter a name, and then maybe when we click the submit button, it can take the name that was in that text field and move that over to, in the case of most forms, probably a database of some kind. So we'll go ahead and make a name label. We have our name text field, and we have our name button. Okay. And so now that we've got all three of these controls, we have these inside of our HBox, which is going to be in our scene, and then that scene is going to be set within our primary stage. So now we can go ahead and take a look at what this setup with all of these controls will look like. So we'll go ahead and close this window. We'll go ahead and compile that again with this newly added content, and then we'll go ahead and display that. And so now you can actually see we've got our name label right here. We've got this text field right in the middle where we can actually type in some text. So perhaps I could just give it my name. And then we have the submit button right here, which is at least clickable, but currently we've not added any functionality to it, so it doesn't actually do anything. And I can also go ahead and resize the window so we can at least see that. And again, just like we saw with those three labels, we'll notice that even as I resize the window, that there's no extra spacing between these and there's no padding along that edge. So again, we still run into those same problems that I want to be able to address a little bit later. Okay. So at this point, this is going to wrap up this particular video. And the next one, what I want to take a look at is actually exploring the design process for setting up one of these GUI applications by taking into consideration the layout, the visual layout of the elements in the window or in the application window. And then in the next part after that, then we'll actually start to explore how to implement some of the spacing, padding, and customizing the height and width of the application window.